Great. There we go. Connection. Beautiful. Okay. Hi. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight for the second edition of Deaf Stories. And today we have Joanna Agius with us today. She's joining us from Adelaide. And I think I'll hand it over to Jo to get started.
Thank you for inviting me to attend this evening for live streaming. I want to say hi to everyone out there, to my family, my friends, the deaf community members, the Indigenous community members as well. So hello to you all. Firstly, I guess we're all ready to get going. So we really do appreciate and respect the Indigenous people and their knowledge of history. And the Indigenous people have lived on this land from time immemorial, on this beautiful land. And we respect all Indigenous people around Australia. We all have this deep connection with each other, and we respect the Kaurna people of this land that we're meeting on tonight. They are the custodians of the plains, the trees, the animals, the fauna, the river, and the water. And we have a strong spiritual connection and social and cultural connection and family connection that's really very important. We still and continue to have a connection with the land and our elders from the past, present, and future. We care and look after in a safe way our language, our culture, our history, the history that's been taught to us by our elders and brought forward to the present. So we all meet here tonight and share on the information with each other. That's fantastic and so spiritual. I feel that connection. And we all know that the Indigenous history, there's been suffering and trauma and really disempowerment. Since European settlement or colonisation around Australia took over this beautiful land, the oppression that we suffered, that must stop. It must stop, and we must have equality. So thank you for watching.
Wow, what a beautiful Auslan version of an acknowledgement to country. Thank you, Joanna. I would like to acknowledge that I am now living and working and existing on the land that belongs to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge that the traditional custodians have looked after this land of where I work, and I want to acknowledge their elders, both past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to acknowledge all the lands and all the country across Australia from all the different Indigenous groups that have looked after them and taken care of the land. So I acknowledge them all. And I'd also like to quickly acknowledge the deaf leaders that we've had before us that have worked so hard for the deaf community, whether it's been advocating, providing opportunities, and have really helped establish the deaf community we have now. And the current emerging ones as well. If we didn't have them, if we wouldn't have had this opportunity that we have tonight. And thanks to that, our community is connected and stronger than ever with all the events that we've been able to arrange. It's also important to know that the leaders work together and continue to grow and make a stronger deaf community. So I would really, really, really like to say I'm so excited to have you here tonight, Jo. Now, the reason why I invited you to come along for the Deaf Stories Live is that it's really important for us to know what's going on, especially with what's happening globally with the Black Lives Matter movement. And also really recognise that Australia has its own dark history. Our own dark history of the treatment of Indigenous people throughout the country. And it's really important for the deaf community as well to engage in dialogue about the treatment of the Indigenous Australians. So, Jo, can you explain just a little bit about yourself?
Well, firstly, my mob, well, we're the Narungga people in South Australia, 2 hours from Adelaide onto the Yorke Peninsula. And my grandfather's from that area. My grandmother is from a place called Streaky Bay. That's a little bit further over towards the west. Now, both my grandparents are Indigenous people. So I have a strong connection with Indigenous people in the past as well. So for me, myself, well, I was born not in Adelaide, but just going to tell you a little bit of a story about how all this happened. Now, my mother was living in Gawler. That's a small little town in South Australia, and she was living there, and my father was living there as well, and they met each other in Gawler. And so they had a relationship, and then my mother became pregnant and then moved to Brisbane. So I was actually born in Brisbane. Funny, a lot of people think that I was actually born in Adelaide, but I wasn't. I wish I was, but I wasn't. So my mother was pregnant and then moved to Brisbane. So yeah, so I was born in Brisbane, yeah. But I moved to Adelaide, sort of half my life spent in Brisbane and half my life in Adelaide.
Yeah, right. Great. So you're saying you grew up in Brisbane?
Yes, well, half my life was in Brisbane until the age of 21, 22, and then I moved to Adelaide.
And you've been in Adelaide ever since?
Yeah, ever since. I've had a few little travel trips, but mostly Adelaide, yes.
Oh, for sure. And do you feel more of a connection to Adelaide?
Yes, I do.
Your country?
Yes, my father's side of the family are from Adelaide and my mother's side are from Brisbane. So my father has a very strong connection to his family here in Adelaide.
Right. That's really interesting to know that, and especially about the different countries or the different Indigenous groups. How many do you have in Adelaide? Or all over?
Do you mean Auslan users or? So
I just
could you
wanted to
repeat that question again?
How many mobs or how many Indigenous tribes are there?
There's over 200 language groups, different language groups around the state of South Australia. So there's quite a few.
Wow, that's amazing. And what's your identity, Joanna?
Well, I am a very proud deaf Indigenous woman. I don't really like to label myself, really. I'm a lesbian as well. I'm involved in the gay community, but don't really like labels. So I just like being with a woman, that's all. And it depends on the group that I'm in. I might actually disclose that. Sometimes I might not, depending on who I'm with.
Yeah, okay, cool. I was really keen to hear about your experiences growing up as an Indigenous deaf person. What were they like?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually. I grew up, well, you know that I was born in Brisbane and I grew up there. I went to a mainstream school. I didn't see any difference in regards to skin colour. I knew I was dark, and my brother and sisters were all dark-skinned. My mother was white. Just didn't think about it at that time. I went to Indigenous events, but I just didn't really understand what that actually meant. And I thought it was just normal to be the way we were. I didn't really grow up as an Aboriginal child until later in age, because at the school, you know, there were, you know, as you get older, you start to question life. And then friends were saying, you know, they started to ask me about my skin colour because I was dark. And I thought, oh yeah, I never actually thought about it until they asked me the question. So I asked my mother, I said, what's our background? And my mum said, what answer was, your father's Aboriginal. But at that time, in the part, you know, in the 1980s, 90s, around that time, there was a lot of events happening that were negative in the paper, on the television, that were negative about Indigenous people being drunk on the street. They're doing nothing. They steal things. They're lazy. And when I found out I was an Aboriginal child, I thought, oh, how can I say that to my friends? And I was really worried about being rejected by them. And I was really, really concerned. I was really frightened to tell my friends my background, because I'd already been bullied at school because I was different anyway, because of the dark skin, being fat as well, and deaf. In a mainstream school, I was bullied. So I didn't really want any more rejection. And I felt afraid to say anything. And most people thought that I might have been Maori or a European woman. I said, oh, yeah. Because then I could be involved in that community, felt I had a connection.
Wow. Oh, that would have been really difficult.
Yes.
Growing up in Queensland, you know, I know what Queensland's like. It's a very strong Anglo-Saxon white place. And yeah, I just couldn't even imagine what that must have been like for you. I wonder, what, if anything, was your involvement in the deaf community in that experience growing up?
The deaf community. Lots and lots of times I meet, you know, deaf people. You know, I started getting involved in the deaf community and I've met quite a few. When I introduce myself with my name, they'll ask me a question, what's your background? Think, oh, that's hard. Okay, right. I have to tell them that I'm Indigenous. And when I say that I'm Indigenous, they say, are you really? You don't look Indigenous. You don't look like that. You look like a European person or Spanish or Maori. Think, oh, they also say you look really intelligent. Wow. They're trying to compare. And that sort of impacts on me a bit and quite offensive at times. And I don't like it. I don't really like it at all.
Wow, yeah, it's not nice. Can you tell me a little bit more, if you feel comfortable, that is? Can you go on?
Well, so talking about how I feel about being an Indigenous woman, or?
Well, I suppose when people perceive you, when they look at you as an Aboriginal woman, and how they perhaps would treat you, and whatever stereotypes that others would place upon you. Those stereotypes from their perceived notions of Aboriginal people, how did that have an effect on you?
Well, often, you know, when I'm talking about my indigeneity, you know, and issues like that, we'll be in a debate. And I feel like the white way, you know, more supreme. And they say, I disagree. They just do not understand. They don't live and breathe my life. They haven't grown up like me as an Indigenous person. Okay. So yes, there's a lot of political arguments. political things. Like, for example, I'll never forget this. Deaf people say, oh, you know, Joanna, you know, you get a really good pension because I know Indigenous people get more money. I have a huge laugh about that. No, I do not get a massive pension. I don't get more than everyone else. I get the same pension as everyone else. The only difference is that we have extra support for education, for attending university, housing, health, things like that. We have a little bit of extra support, that's all. But we don't get a big pension. So that's a big thing that the deaf community assume, that deaf Indigenous people or the Indigenous community get more money than everyone else. They're still quite doubtful even when you explain it to them. So that's one thing that's stuck in my mind. Yeah.
That's really interesting. You know, when people make these assumptions and comparisons, it's mind-blowing. And to think that there's some sort of added benefit for being Indigenous, I'm sure
we're the
it's
same,
similar.
We're the same.
Yeah, completely agree. Also, I've been wondering about Auslan and sign language. What sign's more appropriate? The sign for Aboriginal, sign for Indigenous? What is the preferred sign for Aboriginal deaf people?
Yes, that is a big thing. So there are two signs. Remember recently Samantha and I put out a video about the appropriate signs for Aboriginal, Indigenous, because people get confused which one to use.
Yeah.
Mostly we would use, this is the sign we would use, but in Cairns we have to respect the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Cairns. They use this particular sign and we respect that.
Right, okay.
But going back to why we don't use that sign, because it seems to be related to that labelling of alcoholics, alcohol, and we feel quite sensitive with that and we don't like it. So we would prefer this sign, just like Māori, which is on the chin, and Aboriginal. Indian also on the chin. So I think that that's the identity, the correct identity, not this sign. That's probably related more to using alcohol, but we respect the people in Cairns that use that particular sign for Aboriginal and Indigenous. So it's really best whenever you meet an deaf Indigenous person, ask them what sign they prefer to use and then use that sign.
Yeah, of course. Completely agree with you. I've seen some deaf people have these discussions, which is the appropriate sign to use, whether it's Aboriginal sign this way or Aboriginal sign that way. And yeah, like you said, it's better to ask the deaf Aboriginal person that you're talking to what their preference is.
Yes, that's right. I agree.
Yeah. So I was wondering about the Black Lives Matter movement. How has that had an effect on you?
Oh, a huge impact. One video that I organised about talking about Black Lives Matter and the protests here in Adelaide, that day it was raw emotions when we put that up. Felt very, very emotional on how society treats Indigenous people and in America and really around the world. That racism, that system of racism has not actually been repaired. In America, unfortunately, it's over 400 years, it's been ongoing, this fighting for their rights. And there's nothing really taking place and people are getting tired. It's like this record that keeps going on and on and on. And Indigenous people in Australia as well, when colonisation took place, it's sort of similar system, really, that what took place in America. And how I felt quite traumatised and emotional, and it impacted upon my family, myself, and the deaf community as well. So often the deaf community say, oh, that's fine, don't worry about it, it's okay, don't worry. No, it's like they're telling me to shut up. No, this is an issue. So, for example, I'll give you an example of what the deaf community would think and say. So I remember when in the past, I'd go shopping, with my family, or friends who are Indigenous would go shopping as a group. And often the security guards, standing when you're going into the shopping centres, often they would actually really monitor you and follow you because of our skin, and they were monitoring us all the time. Felt like saying, go away. Like, what are you looking at? We'd say, what are you looking at? But they were monitoring, thinking we're going to steal something. Compared to the deaf community, they go in as a group, and I've been with deaf friends going in as a group, there's not that same monitoring. They're not assuming that you're going to steal anything. So there's a huge difference. And it really is a big impact when you see the differences of how people are treated. And that attitude really has to change. Why are they targeting Indigenous people? Why do they think we're going to steal things all the time? Maybe we behave differently. Like deaf people sign, hearing people look and, oh, they're frightened of that as well. They think deaf people are angry, but deaf people are not angry. But it's the same with, the deaf community, that the way they walk and behave, they behave differently. It's just their cultural norm. But people don't understand that. So that upsets me to see that difference. And I saw that difference as I grew up as well. And confusing as well. Like, why can they behave like that? Why do they behave like that? Why can't we all have the same standard of treatment? And also, one of my cousins refuses to go to a nightclub because of the targeting. So the cousin prefers to stay at home, just drink with close friends at home. But to go out, no, rather stay at home in a safe environment because of the targeting that takes place in the mainstream environment.
Yeah. Of course, they wouldn't feel comfortable. That would be hard for you and your Indigenous friends and family feeling so stigmatised like that. From the Black Lives Matter movement, I've seen a lot of people putting out different bits of information, sharing of resources, and I just want to know, how can we become about being anti-racist? Apologies. How we treat people equally. And I suppose what I want to ask is what I'd like to see from the deaf community. What would you like to see, Jo?
Well, I'd like to see the deaf community be more supportive, because at the recent rally, there were about 4 non-Indigenous people that attended who are deaf. No other people attended. So I found that a bit disappointing, and that's sort of ongoing. Another example, if I went to an Indigenous event or a rally or a protest, I've always got to invite people, say, come along with us, and the deaf community or whatever, come with us and support us. And usually only very small numbers come. So, for example, also I support the deaf community in what they're doing, but I look and think, where is the support coming our way, the reciprocal support? Come and learn our culture, develop a better understanding without having assumptions and going by assumptions. If people did get involved, they may understand a little bit better. So it's sort of a little bit frustrating that this is ongoing like this all the time. And also, the big thing about Andy, and on Facebook, everything that went on about him, and the Voice and how he signed on the Voice, that really impacted upon the deaf community. And when I saw that there was the deaf community lobbying and saying a lot of things about that, but forgetting about the Indigenous people and the people in America and what was happening around the world. Like just focusing on what happened here on The Voice, the spotlight went to Andy, all about Andy. And it's like, that's a small thing. That's not really creating a high risk. People aren't going to die. The deaf community aren't at risk from him. But Black people in America, Indigenous people are. And deaf Indigenous people are incarcerated. Can you imagine that? Right.
Yeah, it is a high percent. I've recently
That's
learned
what I
those figures.
mean. So where's the deaf community's heart to try and support the issues that are happening in our community? But all that spotlight went to Andy, and that's such a small thing. And you're over here with the Black Lives Matter, such a big thing. Just,
Yeah, it is. It's frustrating and disappointing to see that. And especially, like you said, the Aboriginals of Australia, they're the oldest living culture of 40,000 years of history here in Australia. It's huge. And that really means that we need to learn more about Indigenous cultures that we have here in Australia and really embed it into our knowledge. And it's important to learn about how we can best support Aboriginal people here. It's their country, whether they're deaf or hearing.
Sometimes I feel like we're a forgotten people, that we are a forgotten people. People just forget about us.
Yeah.
Like when I was growing up, right, say, you know, if I went to an Indigenous service because I had a relationship there because of cultural understanding, but the problem was couldn't communicate. So when I wanted to say things about being deaf, they just didn't understand that. Why do you need an interpreter? Oh, that's too expensive. Our organisation can't afford that. And there were barriers there. So then when I go to a deaf organisation, great, can communicate there, but I feel that that organisation is a white organisation and they're all white people, Anglo-Saxon people in that organisation. They don't have anyone who's Indigenous. They don't show the Indigenous flag. They have no connection to the Indigenous community. And I feel that I'm not equal there. And there are barriers in both sectors for me. So I feel like the deaf Indigenous people, we're a forgotten people.
Yeah, there's huge gaps.
There's a gap there. And also, being gay as well, where do I go? There's a barrier here, there's a barrier there, there's a barrier everywhere. There's gay counsellors and all of those sorts of services, but there's nothing for the provision of interpreting service. That was in the past. There was no interpreting service provision there. I had no access. But now it is a little bit better. It is improving. There's access to interpreters. NDIS has improved that environment, but a very different upbringing.
Yeah, completely different. I can imagine. Profound. Some of the things I've seen, you know, I've been seeing racism happening within the deaf community. Are you able to explain a little bit about your experience and what you've seen?
I've got lots of examples of racism within the deaf community. Lots and lots. Now, okay.
Go ahead.
So I remember my first job at 262 South Terrace in Adelaide. That was the Deaf Society. It was called Deaf SA at that time.
Yep.
And I worked there. I was really excited. They hired me. I was the first deaf Indigenous leader working in that organisation. I was really proud of my job. I was young, probably around about 25 at that time. Yeah, young, I remember that. Really excited though, had my own office that was set up for me, big office, had a computer, an old computer, you know, the old PCs.
Yes, I know those.
But I was really excited to be in my office. Then I started networking with the Indigenous community because my family here in Adelaide, so I had new people within the community, so I created those networks. And then deaf Indigenous people started to be connected. And I'll never forget one day, one deaf man came into my office and stood at the door. Nice office you have here. Just wondering. He asked me lots and lots of questions. How many deaf Indigenous people in South Australia? I was young. I was learning on the job as well. He stood there, looked. I feel that the deaf Indigenous people in this state, they won't grow in numbers. I thought, wow, I felt really hurt. That's racism. I thought, wow. And from then on, I tried to avoid that person and tried to talk to me, but I avoided that person. And I thought, wow. I thought, shame on you. You're not well educated. But how could he dare say that to me in my office when I was just started my new job? I was young. That's disgusting. So that's one experience. The other one, oh, that's right. My three deaf Indigenous friends, one of them you probably know, I've asked permission if I can actually share their story, and they have said yes, but I'll do it in brief because, you know, they can tell you the longer story. But Samantha, you know, the girl that was with me just recently when we posted that video.
Yeah.
Samantha and Monica and Hayley from Sydney. And we went to Albury for the Australian Deaf Games.
That was the recent 2018 Deaf Games?
Yeah, that's right, 2018 Deaf Games. So they went, I couldn't go, but they went. And there was another deaf girl, Indigenous girl, and her name is Natasha. And she was there as well. And she was the first person to actually have the acknowledgement to country, the first Indigenous person at the Games to give the acknowledgement to country.
Yeah, it was a beautiful moment.
And then after that, they did the national anthem.
Yep.
The three deaf Indigenous girls from South Australia, they looked back, but unfortunately, the sports committee got quite angry because they turned their back. Does that mean the three deaf Indigenous girls had attitude? And they said, what more do Aboriginal people want? So the three girls were very, very upset because that type of attitude and that type of behaviour is not required. So that still happens within the deaf community. And a lot of the deaf community deny that, say, no, we don't think like that or feel like that. But say, for example, okay, can you imagine if the deaf community, they had a fantastic attitude, were welcoming, were inclusive, were encouraging, then I'm sure that a lot of deaf Indigenous people would feel they could be involved if they listened to us. But most deaf people say there's not enough deaf Indigenous people, but there are. We have quite a number of them. And just recently, when I made the video from around Australia, you know, Black Lives Matter, when I compiled that video.
Beautiful video.
There were lots of deaf Indigenous people from around Australia. And I had lots and lots of posts. So many, they were saying, so many. Well, of course there are. But they don't feel that they're equal within the community. They don't feel that they have a way to go. They have barriers placed. So they want to stay in a safe place. That's just like the deaf community. They want to stay in a safe place from the hearing community. But can you imagine? It's doubly worse. So where can they go? So the deaf community say, where are they? But we have to stay within that safe space. And usually when we go out, or just say, for example, if I was going out with my cousins or the Aboriginal community, my friends within the deaf community, people would be looking at us thinking, oh, they're dark skinned. That's their reaction. That is, oh, I'm not really that great. They're not welcoming. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's not easy.
So hopefully now, it's the right time now to move forward, and hopefully that the deaf community will be aware now and start listening to us and start supporting us and start being with us. Like you're talking about allies, like where are allies? We don't see that happening in the community. Where are our allies coming from the deaf community? We're left out. So we're always fighting and fighting.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Joanna. You know, if deaf people really want to be allies with people from outside the deaf community, they need to be allies themselves for other minority groups. Because, you know, being an ally is a two-way
That's
street.
right.
It has to be reciprocal. And for deaf people themselves, they also have diverse identities. Could be Aboriginal, gay, deaf. And how do deaf people, you know, unpack all of those different identities at the same time? Which identity might be more important for them? And I'm sure your identity would be your Aboriginality, and then deaf second.
You actually raised that point. Often people, you know, the deaf people ask me questions like, do you identify as deaf or Indigenous first? Now that's a good question actually. So I was born deaf. So my father's Indigenous. I learned deaf culture first because of communication issues.
Yeah, right.
So, and I was involved in the Indigenous community but couldn't really communicate, so didn't have cultural understanding. So I feel split. So half and half. Probably more being able to communicate more with the deaf community, so I feel proud about that. So really just depend on the day on how I feel. But mostly I would say I'm a proud deaf Indigenous woman. And so that's my identity, being deaf first, because of the communication that goes along with that. And I'm still involved in the Indigenous community, but that's how I would identify myself.
I wonder, did you grow up learning about your Aboriginal identity? Was there anything you didn't learn about until later on in life?
Later, yeah. When I moved to, I grew up in, I knew the Aboriginal community in Brisbane, but communication was a bit of a barrier there, so it wasn't great. So when I moved to Adelaide with my Indigenous family, I was involved. The communication was a barrier, but I saw things. So I'd go to the Aboriginal TAFE, I'd go to Aboriginal events, I started asking questions. So I'm still learning every day about my culture. So there's still the communication issue, but now with interpreting access, it's much better. So much better now compared to the past.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you're learning more about your Aboriginal identity. And as you do that, like, how does that make you feel?
Well, I feel really strong about it, really assertive, really proud. I'm proud of my history. I'm proud of my Indigenous family. Yeah, it's different when I was younger, when I was really unsure, but now, no, I am completely involved. I'm very, very proud of my identity. No one's standing in my way. I'm going to be assertive and get through.
Oh, awesome. I really agree with you there. And it's really good to see that. I want to know who's had the biggest impact on you when it comes to developing your
My
Aboriginal
dad.
identity.
My dad. He's a huge role model, my
Can you
dad.
tell me a bit more about him?
I'll try and keep the story short about my dad. Well, when I was growing up in Brisbane, I started to feel that I knew that the man in my mum's life wasn't my dad. Because you know, every child wants to know who their parents are. And I wanted to know who my father was. So I was asking questions like, what did my father look like? What if I met him? Anyway, as I was growing up, I was looking for him, asking mum questions, but there were barriers put in front of me. And so when I moved out when I was 14, I left home when I was 14, and things happened through life. And then when my first son was born, I felt that I had to find my dad. You know, it stuck in my mind that I had to find him. So one day I went to the Salvation Army, Salvation Army office, and I went in there. They help people, you know, find missing parents or missing family members. So I attended their office. And I said, look, I want to know about my dad. Can you help me? And they said, yes, look, we need his name, date of birth, things like that. And I only knew his name was Joseph Agius. I knew that. And I knew he was born in November. I knew he lived in South Australia. But I needed more information about his date of birth. I knew it was November. So I went to my mum and said, look, when was he born? Finally, she gave me the information. So I went back, gave the Salvation Army the information, and they said they'd do some research and try and find some information for me. And I had to wait and wait, but they found some information, and he was living in Cairns at that time. Bit of funny, you know, I laughed at that time, but they found him in Cairns. And then they said, do you want to write a letter to your dad? You can write a letter and enclose a photograph. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll do that. I was really nervous writing, you know, draft after draft. You know, there was no email at that time. You know, the old-fashioned, you know, pen and paper and postage. So I had to try writing these letters. So finally I got a letter together and posted it. And in that letter, I let him know that I was deaf as well. And I was hoping that he wouldn't reject me being a deaf child. I was hoping and hoping, because I'd had so many rejections throughout my life, and I was hoping that he wouldn't reject me. So the letter went to him. And then the woman at Salvation Army called me to say that there was an answer for me. And my son was 1 at that time, just before he was 1. So I took him in the pram, went to the Salvation Army, and the lady was in the room. I sat down and she said there were a box of tissues there for you. And I thought, oh, I don't know what they would be there for, but there was a box of tissues on the table. I sat down and they took my son out to play with him, to look after him. So I had a quiet room. I thought it was weird at the time, but what for?
Wow.
Why are they doing this? But anyway, she gave me the letter. It was already open because apparently they have to read it before they hand it to the person. So she gave me the letter, and I was breathing. I was, you know, my heart was pounding. You know, all these things were going through my mind. What if he rejects me? What if he doesn't want me? What if? All these what ifs that I was thinking about. And the lady walked out, closed the door. I was there by myself with no one else in this quiet room. I thought, okay, open the letter. And I read it, and straight away, I just started to cry, buckets of tears. I'm even getting emotional now. I was crying. I really wanted to see what my dad looked like. And I looked at the photos. Beautiful man. That's him. That's my dad. He's Indigenous. And he was with there was a photograph with him with my grandmother. And my dad said, you know, he was so glad to have found me because he was always wondering. He knew about me, but he didn't know where I was or where I ended up. But he knew about me.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll never forget that. So anyway, through time, we were corresponded with letter writing, had a few phone calls. And then, oh, that's what I remember. At my 21st birthday, I told my dad I wanted to invite him to Brisbane for my 21st. And my dad said, oh, maybe you might not have had the money to be able to afford it. I said, okay. And then on my 21st birthday party, everyone arrived. You know, there was a huge deaf crowd there, and plus my family. And then someone said, Joey, there's a taxi coming, pulling up out the front. Or maybe, you know, there's a friend coming that doesn't want to drink and drive after. And then I saw two men, big men, walking towards the house. It was a bit dark. I thought, who are they? And then my father was coming towards me. I thought, oh, my father. And that's the first time I'd actually met my dad in real life. And I started to cry. The first word I said was, hello, Dad. And then hug, and all the deaf people was really cheering because they knew that I'd been talking about him, looking for him, talking and talking so much about him. And finally I met him after 21 years. I finally met him. And that whole night, my dad was sitting next to me by the fire, looking at him and holding on to him. And we had this really strong connection. And then from then on, I moved to South Australia to be here with him because with the family, I feel a real strong connection to my identity and pride. And I always look at my dad. I have this real strong connection with him.
Wow, that story gave me goosebumps. Beautiful. Oh, it's 7:50 already, so we're due to have a 10-minute break, and that way the interpreters can have a bit of a break. Everybody watching at home can go get something to eat or drink, okay? We'll see you back at 8 o'clock. Great, thanks.
Thank you. She'll leave the screens on. Thank you.
Okay. Great. All good. Welcome back. Hope we all had a nice little intermission. Yeah, we've only got about 20 minutes left. Sorry, just got some technical problems. The other microphone wasn't working.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Great. Wonderful. So, Jo, you recently got an OAM, the Medal of the Order of Australia. What a huge recognition to your work and your service that you've provided to the deaf Aboriginal community. And I'm wondering if you could tell me the story of how you got that.
Yes, definitely. Well, I used to live in Sydney for a while, for around about 7 years. And I lived in Sydney and I was heavily involved still within the Aboriginal community there. And I was a board member of at that time, it was called the First Peoples Disability Network. And that organisation I was a board member of. And I was there for quite a while because I've moved here to Adelaide, but I'm still a member of that organisation. And I've been a member for many, many years, really for a long time. I have this really strong connection and good relationship with the First Peoples of Disability of New South Wales. Anyway, I have that connection. I'm not sure if they knew that I had organised the deadly, this is a sign for death, deadly deaf mob in Sydney in 2015. I'd set up that group. That was the first deaf Aboriginal gathering. And at that time, the reason was to try and bridge the gap between the Aboriginal organisations and the deaf organisations to try and come together and to be able to work together. That was my aim for that conference. So it's a huge job. It was voluntary. There was no payment involved in it, no pay at all. Plus the funding that I received, I can't remember now. I think it was some disability funding. I applied for some funding, got a small amount, and some other funding from another disability organisation. And so I had the money to put together and to move forward. And I had 4 deaf Aboriginal people organising, the leaders helping. And really, that was the first time that I'd ever been involved in anything like that. Do you remember Kirk? You probably know Kirk from Adelaide.
Yes, I do.
Kirk, and also Marcia Sutton from Sydney, a deaf Aboriginal woman, and Hayley Martin from Sydney as well. So the 4 of us at that time were living in Sydney. I was really excited. We had this funding, working together to get this first time conference off the ground, and had the leaders and the different roles and responsibility, like Kurt, he organised the tickets for the Aboriginal deaf people to fly to Sydney from around Australia. We had around about 30 deaf Aboriginal. We could have had more, but there was a limit. If we had more money, then we could have had a big gathering, but the money was limited. So there are a lot of deaf Aboriginal people from Cairns, New South Wales, I think one from Melbourne, South Australia there was 1 or 2, and in Western Australia, I can't quite remember, but we had this gathering. It was so exciting, meeting all these people, and we worked through that. And also I was working at that time as the Accessible Arts New South Wales, and I was the deaf Aboriginal Art Network person, and I had both jobs going, one voluntary job and also working at my job, so they did overlap a little bit, and I was supporting the deaf community within the arts world in Sydney and busy with the deaf Aboriginal community in Sydney, so quite busy, and I'll never forget that time, but we got through it. And anyway, then I decided to move back to South Australia. And everyone knew that my ex-partner passed away. So I moved back to South Australia. It was quite emotional at that time. So I came back to family. And then somehow, someone asked me, look, we need your email address. So I passed that on. And then a few weeks later, I got an email from the Governor-General congratulating me on the award. I said, oh, that's a scam. That's someone, you know, I was thinking that can't be true, and I read the letter again. I thought, that's a scam. I would never be given that OAM. No, we know that's got to be a joke. So I showed my partner, and I said, look, have a look. Is this real or a scam? And my partner said, you have got an award. I was not expecting that. I was not expecting that at all. An OAM, so I did some research, Googling to find out what it was, and I thought, oh. Then I looked at past recipients, and there are other deaf people that have received that award, the OAM, and it was awarded to me for my work with the Aboriginal deaf community and the deaf community, recognition for my past work. So that was the nomination was from Sydney. I still don't know who nominated me. They won't divulge that information to me. Anyway, I should have got the medal just recently, but unfortunately with the coronavirus that happened, now it's been delayed and postponed. And my family, oh, they think it's fantastic. Particularly my dad, so proud of me, plus the Aboriginal community, my family, my son, so proud of me. Very exciting.
Wow, that is a huge moment for you. Are you the first Aboriginal person to get that award, or has somebody else gotten it?
Well, that's a good question, actually. Good question. Maybe I could be the first. Oh, I could be wrong. I don't know. Don't really know. Maybe I'm the first person. If not, maybe there have been some past recipients. Good question. But
interesting to know.
Good to know.
Definitely. So you were talking then about the Deadly Deaf Mob. Can you tell me more about them?
Well, yes. Well, the Deadly Deaf Mob are from around Australia. Just going back a little bit, I thought I was the only deaf Aboriginal person because I was on my own growing up. Then when I started working and creating networks and having these connections with people and seeing the mob grow in number, so, you know, calling the Deadly Mob, because at the conference we had to think of a name. So it was at the conference we actually kept that name, and we can continue to use it because it's our mob. Yeah.
What's the purpose of the Deadly Deaf Mob? Is there other plans coming up?
Well, that's interesting. So at the last conference, there was a lot of discussion talking about education. That was one of the discussion points. So, for example, like remote areas, there's a lot of Aboriginal people that have hearing loss, that are deaf. And where's their access? They don't have any And Kurt is living in Alice Springs currently. And he's just given me lots and lots of stories and information. Luckily, he's there because he's working as a deaf Aboriginal BSSO, like a teacher's aide, supporting deaf Aboriginal children. And he said, oh, there are no interpreters available there, none. There's no access to interpreters. From Alice Springs to where the school is, where he's staying, it's 4 hours drive from Alice Springs. So really, he's in a remote area.
Wow.
And there's no services out there. So it's a huge barrier and really impacted on him. And he said, Jo, can you imagine how many deaf, hard of hearing or children out there with no access to communication compared to what we have in the city, in the urban areas. Now, Kurt used to live in Alice Springs. He grew up in Alice Springs. And then his mum was from, I think she was from, you know, Barry was from South Australia and met his mum and said, look, it's better to move to Adelaide. That education would be better for the 2 boys who are deaf. So they came down to Adelaide for schooling and they had better access to sign language tuition as well. So she's really glad that they moved to Adelaide. And there are other issues in education as well. There's no access, there's no language, no access to language. And there was another, also the workplace as well, the workplace. Funny thing, saying that in that group, there's not, like for example, I said, why don't you hire a deaf Aboriginal person in that organisation to work with clients and they feel that connection? The most response is that you get, oh, they don't have the skills, they don't have the qualifications. Wow, that sort of attitude. They should be actually bringing people in, supporting them, training them, teaching them to get those qualifications and to bring them on board. And I know a few organisations who will employ a deaf Aboriginal person, but I still feel that it's like tokenism. Like, we've got this person here, we've got this deaf Aboriginal person here, but still they don't feel culturally involved or included. Like I've said previously, please have cultural awareness training. Please show the flag. Please have mentoring. So you have an Aboriginal person like me. I could mentor. Most of the time, I'd have to do it voluntary. Most of the times I get a call, like, I know what to, am I doing the right thing? Am I explaining it? So I'm talking to them in a voluntary capacity, but that's that connection. So there's a big issue within the workplace regarding that. And I feel that maybe there should have a few deaf Aboriginal people working within that workplace so that had a team to support each other. So how would you feel in a hearing workplace? Just say, if you have, 5 or 6, say, 3 or 4, 5 or 6 hearing people. So there's a balance there. You've got deaf and hearing. Can you imagine if they're all hearing and just a few deaf? So there's an imbalance there. So that's the same thing. If you're hiring one deaf Aboriginal person, there's still a huge imbalance and it's worse.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
really it's that area that you need to give support, you need a cultural awareness training, and you need to support them, and staff need to go to those events. If they organise events, please be involved. Most of the time, and often what happens, an event is organised and an invitation is sent out and the staff don't turn up. So that sort of thing needs to change. That's two things. The feeling of isolation when you go back, the conference, everyone felt this connection, and then when they went home, they felt isolated and lonely. So that was a huge impact. No one wanted to go home at that time. I remember that. Everyone wanted to stay together because of that strong connection, that supporting of each other. It was amazing, that feeling. and learning from each other, wanting to learn more. And that's because of being deaf, Aboriginal, we're all the same, been able to communicate with each other and going home on our own. So we were hoping to get funding for the future, a huge bucket of funding, so that all deaf Aboriginal people from around Australia could meet. That would be beautiful.
Oh, it looks like Joe's frozen for us. Joe. Okay. Oh, looks like her computer's just shut down. Oh no. What a shame. Joe will rejoin us in a second on another device. Well, lucky we've got an interpreter booked for a little bit longer. You know, technology, what can you do? Great. Joe's finally back.
Can you hear me, Kelly?
Yes. Okay, Joe's back. Pop that on gallery view. Looks like Joe's frozen again. Okay, Joe's just trying to work out the technology on her end.
Sorry. Joe's just saying really, really sorry. The computer.
Joe's just said she'd like to apologise to everybody for her computer crashing. Joe's trying to establish a connection again now. And for those at home that can still see me, please keep putting up your comments and your questions up on YouTube or anything up on the Facebook event page. I know there was an issue with the link to the live, and I'm really sorry for that. I'm going to look into it and see what I can do to fix it. But please, if there's any comments or questions you want to ask Joanna, she can look over them and respond to them as she can. Thank you again for being patient. Yay, there she is.
Can you hear me now, Kelly?
Great. All good.
I'll tell you about, you know, technology. I hate technology. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. Technology is never perfect.
I'm sorry to everyone out there in the audience land, but that's keeping you all awake.
Yeah, everyone's keen, aren't they? Okay, do you remember what we were just talking about?
I've forgotten now.
Technology.
That's right. We were talking about the deaf community. Wait a minute, there's a bit of feedback.
Looks like there's a bit of feedback with the interpreters.
It's off now. I hope that's okay.
Perfect. So, the deadly deaf mob.
Oh yes, that's right. When we were talking about that, the workplace.
Maybe you need to chuck the iPad into another room, Joe.
Is that better now?
Sherry.
Hi everybody. I think this is one of the worst technical, terrible nights I've ever had.
Well, I think it's funny, you know, and it shows no one's perfect.
That's right. That's very true. I agree.
No such thing as a perfect live stream. We just have to get through it and try our best.
Definitely. Okay.
What are we
Coming
talking
back.
about?
Okay. Yes. The work, education, the workplace, social as well. The deaf community, socially, the conversation, not really enough support. Mostly, you know, the famous thing, the deaf community will say, oh, look, it's just better to leave them the way they are. Don't get too involved. Don't have a big discussion. Just leave it, just leave it, just leave it. I don't like that. I think we should get involved and be together, and that's the thing that I feel. What more? Oh, that's right. having more like, you know, learning cultural awareness, Aboriginal culture, because we didn't have interpreters available at that time in the past. So it'd be good to be able to share feelings and create that connectedness as well. That's a missing gap.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I did some research myself about Aboriginal deaf people in the last few weeks, especially after the Black Lives Matter movement's come to a forefront. I'm sorry, I'm having a problem signing the word matter at the moment.
Yes.
Important matter.
Sign it like this.
Yes. And I'm just wondering, yeah, the things that I've read about the high incarceration numbers of deaf people, Aboriginal deaf people, the levels of hearing loss in comparison to non-Indigenous people. The high percent of Indigenous people with the hearing loss in prison, in custody.
That's right. Yes.
And also just recently, you know, there's no interpreters in the Northern Territory. Deaf Northern Territory is deaf NT is shutting this down.
Where's the support there?
Exactly. Where's the support for the deaf Indigenous people in the Northern Territory? That's probably the biggest gap that exists.
Yeah, that huge gap.
And, you know, that's heartbreaking to see that. What did you want to say about that?
Well, like I said again, it's going back to funding, isn't it? People, you know, like people who employ people, organisations who employ people, sort of feel that there should be more. Like in the past, I remember at the conference, I was hoping that the deaf organisations and the Aboriginal organisations would work together.
Yeah, that would be nice to see.
Separated. I don't know why they continue to be separated. Like, for example, like I said before, you know, I go to an Aboriginal organisation, but they don't understand about deaf issues. You go to a deaf organisation, they don't understand about Aboriginal cultural issues. So again and again, I've said this, please make this connection. The two organisations working together in partnership. I can't see why it can't happen. And I don't know why they're separated, because there's the double barriers for deaf Aboriginal people within the community.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jo.
So it's like being split in half, going to one organisation for something and another organisation for another, and you should be able to go to one. I did actually mention to organisations, please have a reconciliation action, and I've been to organisations to ask them, but it's never ever happened. Some have, but it's fallen over. So I just don't know. I really feel, and unfortunately, you know, I'm not a consultant being involved. So maybe that's what they need to do. Or maybe there's a funding issue. I don't really know. But they should have something in place.
I wonder, those who are watching the live stream tonight, obviously they're considering or perhaps wanting to contribute to the Deadly Deaf Mob. Yes. How can that be done? How can people donate?
Well, currently I'm really excited. I'm about to launch my business, Deaf Aboriginal Services. So at the moment, I'm designing the website. That's just need a little bit of repair and that will release. And that business aim and the purpose is to make sure that all deaf Aboriginal people have access. Like information that will be signed in video format. The NAIDOC week celebrations will be signed. What does it actually mean? Not only for deaf Aboriginal people to watch, but for the deaf community to watch and think, oh, I understand. So I am asking other deaf Aboriginal actors to do some translations and to be signing on that. And that's that purpose. And working with other Aboriginal organisations to see what access they have. They have translations to Auslan, so we can have access to their information. So that's my aim. And also to have Aboriginal children's books, storybooks. For example, I got a grant for the translation from an Aboriginal story into a sign story.
Oh, wonderful.
And I was working with my family members, and there's a dreaming story, and it's called Shark Story. And Mel, my cousin, she did the artwork because she's an artist, computer design, and then I did the sign story, and then my uncle's voice for the voiceover, and we also have captions.
Wow.
So that will be on an app, placed on an app, so then everyone can have access. And but you'll have to pay for that because there's a copyright that's owned by the store, our family, and it's our story.
Yeah,
but
fair
that
enough.
money can go back into the business to create other stories to maintain that. And so everyone can watch it and then develop a better understanding about our culture. And also Samantha, she'll be translating the story as well. Like, where's the galah? Where's the galah? And that book is written by an Aboriginal woman from Perth. And her name is Sally Morgan. And she's a famous author.
Yes, I know her.
And so we've asked permission if we could actually translate her story. So we're getting deaf Aboriginal people to do that sort of work. And there'll be lots of different videos of different deaf Aboriginal people and their translated stories. So I really want to encourage the deaf Aboriginal community to be involved and feel that connection. And that's the aim of my business, to make sure that it's accessible for deaf Aboriginal community members.
Wow. Well, I'm sure that the community will be really happy to see your work once you've launched it.
I will release it and I will let you all know. I've just got a few little things to do and it will be released.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that to the wider audience to see it. One thing before we wrap up, because we've gone over time a little bit.
I know, technology and all those problems, a bit embarrassing, but
don't worry about it. It happens. One last question. What's one thing that you want to tell the deaf community?
Well, what I want to tell the deaf community is please listen, share stories, talk, understand each other, be more involved, learn about our culture, be our ally. You know, think about what they can do to support us, to help us improve the situation. I think it's time to change. And we need to change the attitude. And moving forward, walking together, not one person left behind, but walking together to the future. And I would love, this is my imagination, to see all the deaf and deaf Aboriginal people being together, not separated, but together. Because we're all human beings after all, really. So that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. That's a really beautiful message to say to the deaf community. We'll have to finish up now. And I've just say I've learned so much from you tonight. And I'm sure everybody else who's tuning in at home has really learned something as well from you. Thank you. And it's given us a lot of food for thought. Just want to say thank you so much for your time tonight, Joanna.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to present tonight.
And also, I would like to say thank you to the two interpreters tonight, Kelly North from Melbourne and Heather Loads, who's in Adelaide. And they've both done a wonderful job tonight. So thank you. And I'd also like to say thank you to Jason Bradley for the captioning.
Great.
And again, a big thank you to Expression Australia for the funding to help make deaf stories become a reality this year. And again, thank you to everybody who's been watching from home tonight. Thanks for all your support, for the discussions and the sharing of knowledge we've had. And I hope I can see you again, Joanna, soon. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Bye.